Welcome to Sermon on the Mount. I'm Jeremy Bacon, no relation to Kevin, and the goal of this channel is to unpack little snippets of the Sermon on the Mount to try to help you hear what Jesus is saying to you. In fact, in this is our first video, I want to focus on the idea of audience reaction to this sermon. If we really hear what Jesus is saying, it makes sense that our reaction should probably be about the same as the reaction of the people who were actually sitting on the hill in front of Jesus. You can imagine that scene. There's a gently sloping, grassy hill. Okay, the picture isn't actually the Mount of Beatitudes, it's just a pretty grassy hill. But for them, it was a nice clear day. There were birds, there were flowers. Jesus will literally point to them in the course of doing this sermon. It all sounds very serene. But when Jesus is done and the crowds head home, their reaction wasn't that a nice way to spend the afternoon? It is clear that their reaction is more extreme. But the English doesn't do a good job of conveying the intensity of it. Most English translations from Matthew 7:28 say that the crowds were amazed or astounded. So yeah, it's a big deal. But neither of those English words really capture the violence of the word Matthew uses in this verse. The Greek word exaplesonta, it combines the words for to hit or strike with the word out. So it's the idea of hitting something out. The only English expressions I can think of that capture that well are way too anachronistic. So, if we're going to talk about the Sermon on the Mount, well, where else would we start other than in the trenches of World War I? So, in World War I, for the first time, human beings were exposed to large-scale artillery bombardment. Now, anyone could have predicted the impact of an artillery shell physically on a human being. Obviously, that's going to be horrific. But doctors behind the front lines started to see things that they couldn't process. Soldiers were coming back from the trenches with no visible injuries, but there was clearly something wrong with these guys. Mentally, they were not okay. Now, this was way before we crystallized the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder. On the fly, these doctors were trying to explain what was wrong with these men. The best theory they could come up with was that the concussive force, like the actual air pressure created by these artillery explosions, had literally rattled something loose in these guys' brains. The term they came up with to describe this condition was shell shock. That's almost exactly the picture Matthew is going for in describing Jesus' audience. They're shell-shocked. Something hit them and blew their brain out the back of their head. It's like that emoji with the mushroom cloud coming out of his head. They have had their minds blown. And they walk home almost in a daze, just going, what just happened? That was Jesus' audience. That's a good indication that if we don't have that kind of reaction to this sermon, we may have listened to it, but we didn't really hear it. if you walk away from the Sermon on the Mount and you're not shaken, if you don't feel like you have been confronted by something, then you may not have really heard what Jesus is saying. Now, I'm not trying to judge. Before I started the study that led to writing a book on the Sermon on the Mount, I was definitely familiar with this sermon. I'm a preacher's kid. I've been in the church my entire life. Jesus' most famous sermon was certainly in the air. Then I went on to get a bachelor's and a master's degree in theology. I was actually in ministry for a brief time. That didn't work out. We may mention a little more about that in other videos. But even after that, the new church I joined, I would teach classes there. Then eventually in 2018, I was getting ready for my third week-long trip to do some Bible training for a group of Maasai pastors in southern Kenya. My idea was to use the Sermon on the Mount as kind of a working text to try to illustrate all the different interpretive tools you can use for understanding the Bible. So, in preparation for that, I started memorizing and dissecting Matthew 5 through 7. But it very quickly became obvious that I wasn't the one doing the dissecting. I would come to some particular part of this way of living Jesus presents, and it was like the text was saying to me, you aren't doing that. Now, I could have just ignored it and gone about my business, but the text itself explicitly says, don't do that. It's the final paragraph in the Sermon on the Mount says that you are a fool if you don't make these teachings the foundation for how you live your life. The wise man is the one who hears them and does them. So the Sermon on the Mount was challenging my entire way of life. But it went a lot deeper than that. I couldn't escape the question that I have spent my entire life in American cultural Christianity. Why hadn't I ever been challenged like this before? It was an indication that there was something deeply wrong. But the challenge went even bigger than that. I realized this kingdom that Jesus is presenting is an entirely different worldview. The Sermon on the Mount was blowing apart my life, my culture, my entire view of reality, because Jesus was trying to knock all of that out of me so he could invite me into something new. The purpose of these videos is to try to help you hear how Jesus is calling you. If you want to join us on this journey, hit like, subscribe, all that good stuff. If you don't want to wait, there's a link at the end of the video and in the show notes to where you can get the book I wrote on the Sermon on the Mount. It is a much more thorough walk through the sermon, not skipping anything. But only do that if you are ready to let Jesus challenge any and every area of your life. Because if you let him, he will. Because he wants to invite you to something new. Beyond that, happy travels. See you next time.